I've been bullish on Bitcoin and stablecoins. And stablecoins are kind of the original tokenized real world asset. You're tokenizing the
Hmm.
dollar. I do think the cleaner vehicle overall would just be a spot Bitcoin ETF. That would clear
Right.
up a lot of problems with having Bitcoin in a portfolio. When you look at Bitcoin price action historically, this won't tell you anything on a day-to-day basis, but on like a longer term basis, the major correlate it has is with global broad money in dollar denominated terms.
Lynn Alden, the founder of Lynn Alden Investment Strategy, sheds light on broader economic trends and how they impact the current state of the Bitcoin market. In a decisive development, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission has decided not to appeal a recent court ruling that found it was unjust to reject an application from Grayscale Investments to create a spot Bitcoin exchange-traded fund. A spot Bitcoin ETF would offer investors exposure to the world's largest cryptocurrency by market capitalization without the need to directly own it. However, the SEC has consistently denied all spot Bitcoin ETF applications, including Grayscale's, on the grounds that the applicants lacked sufficient measures to safeguard investors from market manipulation. In the interview, Alden expressed that a spot Bitcoin ETF could provide a more streamlined and effective solution for resolving various problems related to including Bitcoin in an investment portfolio. In the near term, proponents of a bullish Bitcoin outlook cite the approval of a spot Bitcoin ETF as a potential catalyst. However, historical data suggests that a substantial upward trend in Bitcoin's price is more likely to depend on significant year-on-year increases in the M2 money supply growth rates by major central banks. Currently, the Federal Reserve is trying to keep monetary policy tight to rein in inflation, and M2 money supply is at a current level of 20.87 trillion, down from 20.91 trillion last month and down from 21.66 trillion 1 year ago. In the interview, Alden mentioned that when liquidity in the market is on the rise, Bitcoin typically demonstrates strong performance. However, if global M2 remains stagnant or experiences a decline, it tends to exert downward pressure on Bitcoin prices. Now, let's shift our focus to a few clips from the interview.
Market participants would have to then adjust what the next bull
Right.
market's going to look like if a spot ETF exists versus one that does not exist, right? So Bitcoin is not just buyers and sellers right now, it's also people looking out into the future and saying, what is the probability that this thing is going to be successful, right? So what does the regulatory clarity look like? Where are the sources of buyers going to come from? So overall, that is a new variable on forward expectations of price, which is for most participants would be pretty constructive. So I think that could give you either a quick bump or maybe a more durable, kind of smaller, higher level to kind of stagnate around for a while. But I think where that becomes relevant, particularly, is if we have a spot Bitcoin ETF and then we get that global M2
Hmm.
rise, because then the spot ETF's there to absorb any liquidity that wants to come into it that doesn't want to go on chain, right? So there's plenty of capital in brokerages, in 401ks, in other types of environments that would probably make use of a vehicle like that. They've had kind of very limited vehicles so far. So I think it's a catalyst, and that can certainly move around price either to the upside or downside based on what news we get. But I think the more durable rise is likely to happen with the aforementioned global broad money supply. I do think the cleaner vehicle overall would just be a spot Bitcoin ETF. That would clear
Right.
up a lot of problems with having Bitcoin in a portfolio because GBTC has been a flawed product. The futures ETFs are flawed products, and MicroStrategy I think is a good product or a good company, but it's just a very different risk profile than just owning actual Bitcoin. So I would just put that in kind of a separate camp. The same thing with the miners. You're taking on
Yeah.
operational leverage, which gives a very different risk profile. When you look at Bitcoin price action historically, this won't tell you anything on a day-to-day basis, but on like a longer term basis, the major correlate it has is with global broad money in dollar denominated terms. So if you look at global M2, what is the total value of it denominated in dollars? And is that, the rate of change, right? So what does the year-over-year figure of that look like? Bitcoin tends to be highly correlated with that. So
Hmm.
basically, it's a way of saying that Bitcoin is correlated with monetary inflation, which is different than and precedes CPI inflation. And so during periods of rise in liquidity, either because, central banks around the world are printing, or banks are making a lot of credit, or the dollar's weakening, because that's the denominator for global M2 in dollar terms. When any of those major factors are kind of prevailing, Bitcoin is usually doing quite well. And when the majority of those factors are contracting and global M2 is flat or down, that tends to put negative pressure on Bitcoin. So at least that's the demand side. So the way I would
Yeah.
describe it is that over the course of this bear market, the supply side is tightened in the sense that fast money from the prior bull market has largely been washed out. A lot of coins have gravitated towards strong hands, people that are just dollar cost averaging in, hodlers. That's kind of a pattern we see in bear markets. And so there's like basically a coiled spring there. There's not a lot of liquidity for buyers that want to come in. I mean, there's just not a lot of coins kind of ready to leave hands. But then the question becomes, what sparks the next wave of demand? And I
Right.
think it will likely be the next rise in global M2. And I don't really see that as likely in, say, the next 1 quarter, 2 quarters. That doesn't mean you can't fluctuate. I mean, you could go anywhere but up over 30,000. You could go retest 20,000. I don't really have a firm view on that level of range, but I think until it would probably to see a bigger move, we'd have to see a pretty significant move in global M2.
Egypt's annual urban consumer price inflation rose to 38% in September from 37.4% in August, and unfortunately, they are likely going to face another currency devaluation and wave of inflation within the next year. They hold physical cash dollars due to the local currency's significant inflation. Many individuals worldwide desire to possess such assets, but accessing them can be quite challenging. Alden remained bullish on Bitcoin and stablecoins. She pointed out that the technology behind Bitcoin and stablecoins is breaking down these barriers, making it easier for people to access superior assets on a global scale. Now, let's shift our focus to a few clips from the interview.
I've been bullish on Bitcoin and stablecoins. And stablecoins are kind of the original tokenized real world asset. You're tokenizing the dollar. Now that there's positive yields out there, there's also demand for things like treasuries, like this asset. The way I would phrase it is that I've been very critical on most of the crypto space, but there is a platform here, an idea here of making real world assets more accessible, in the sense that, I mean, as an example, I know a physician in Egypt who holds physical cash dollars,
Mm-hmm.
for lack of knowing what else he wants to save it. I mean, the local currency is growing in supply at 20% a year, and so that's one of the things he turns to. There's a lot of capital around the world that'd be happy to own some T-bills, and
Mm-hmm.
the access point is challenging. So if you're inside the U.S., something like a tokenized T-bill is not particularly attractive. You can just
Right.
there's plenty of ways to hold T-bills. If you're in Nigeria, a tokenized T-bill could be quite interesting if you're able to access it. And so we live in this world. There's 160 different currencies.
Mm-hmm.
There's financial borders and firewalls around themselves. They try to keep capital in. And what this technology is doing, whether Bitcoin, whether stable coins, things like that, is they're making these borders more porous. It's kind of saying, instead of just being stuck in your own ecosystem, you can go out and buy a global asset that's better than what is available in your own country. It basically, makes savings and investing more accessible globally. So I,
Right.
I do think that this idea has legs in an international context. Now, of course, the challenge is it's both technology itself, and then there's regulations, because these are potentially disruptive. And so, I think it's also a matter of awareness. So people have to overall take time to trust the systems, realize that this is something that can solve a problem for them. But yeah, I do think that more globally liquid and accessible assets does make sense. Um, I think I view Bitcoin as kind of the foundational innovation here, because that one is the truly decentralized asset. Um, but the main kind of draw from these tokenized assets is that although they're fully centralized, the appeal for a lot of these people is that the central hub is not in their own country. They're accessing something that is outside of their own inflating controlled bubble, and that's attractive to them. It's kind of like
Right.
offshore bank accounts for the middle class, right? That's essentially what this type of technology is currently enabling, and I think that is a real world use case.
After a long time, Bitcoin faced a bullish weekend, regardless of limited buying pressure. Although it indicates the growing strength among the bulls, bears may not be misinterpreted as inactive. The star crypto is following a predetermined trend, which suggests a trend reversal is fast approaching. However, a bearish narrative has always emerged, but the possibilities of a bullish breakout fly high. This wraps up our conversation today. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments section below. If you found this information valuable, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel to stay informed with the latest news and videos. Thanks for joining us.